Have you ever felt a change in the air? Not the weather, but something deeper, a shift in the mood of a city, a nation. In Buenos Aires in the early 1970s, that feeling settled like a quiet dust. The streetlights still glowed, the tango music still played, but an unspoken caution had crept into conversations. It was as if the air itself had learned to listen. This was the beginning of a chapter historians would later call the Dirty War. But before it had a name, it was just a quiet, creeping unease. Argentina, a proud and cultured nation, had lost its balance. The late 60s and early 70s were a time of economic turmoil, strikes, and deep political divides. When governments falter, fear often steps in to fill the void. By 1976, that fear had become a justification. The armed forces announced the process of national reorganization. They said they weren't conquerors, but custodians, there to restore calm. The language was careful. Order, security, discipline. These words can sound comforting until you realize they can also mean silence. The new leadership, headed by General Jorge Rafael Videla, presented itself as a guardian of civilization. He spoke softly, promising an Argentina cleansed of chaos. And people, exhausted by years of instability, wanted to believe him. But beneath the surface, a different system was being built. It was a system of files and offices designed to monitor, classify, and reorganize society according to loyalty. It was efficient precisely because it looked so ordinary. Papers were stamped, reports were filed, and extraordinary power was made to look like simple procedure. Lists were compiled in tidy offices. Students, professors, journalists, community organizers, anyone whose questions sounded too persistent, was watched. This meticulous, bureaucratic approach was what made it so powerful. It wasn't a visible battlefield. It was a quiet network of whispered instructions and neatly filed reports. Life, for most, went on. Shops opened, children went to school, trains ran on schedule. But people learned to read the gestures, the pauses in conversation. Trust became selective. The result was a kind of national hush, not of serenity, but of self-protection. Yet even in that hush, kindness didn't vanish. A neighbor might deliver a message, a priest might shelter a traveler. Resistance often wears an invisible face. The junta's campaign also reshaped the economy, favoring large investors and foreign partnerships. To the outside world, Argentina seemed to be modernizing. But prosperity built on secrecy rarely lasts. The gap between the official story and the private truth widened until everyone could feel it, even if few dared to name it. Meanwhile, thousands of Argentines left the country. Teachers, artists, and professionals carried pieces of Argentina's memory with them to Spain, Mexico, and beyond. They became the exile generation, preserving what could not yet be spoken aloud at home. Letters home were carefully coded, metaphors replacing facts. This diaspora became a crucial archive of the nation's conscience. And back in Argentina, out of that quiet hope, rose one of the most courageous movements in modern history. The Mothers of Plaza de Mayo. In 1977, a handful of women, each searching for a missing son or daughter, began walking together in the public square, facing the presidential palace. They wore white headscarves embroidered with names and dates. Week after week, they returned, walking in slow circles. Their silent procession asked the simplest, most profound question imaginable. Where are our children? That question pierced the heart of power more deeply than any shout could have. At first, authorities dismissed them. But the world took notice. What had been invisible began to take form through those white scarves fluttering in the wind. International awareness grew. Diplomats heard rumors and journalists sensed the contradictions between official optimism and private sorrow. Still, global politics often blurs moral vision. In the Cold War, Argentina's government positioned itself as a reliable partner against extremism, and for years, that narrative protected it from serious scrutiny. In 1978, the world's attention turned to Buenos Aires as Argentina hosted the Football World Cup. For a few weeks, celebration covered the unease. Visitors felt the city's charm, but some foreign reporters noticed the subtle restraint in conversations. History doesn't pause for festivals. It just hides behind them. No system of concealment is permanent. By the late 1970s, small signs of fatigue appeared. The economy faltered. A society cannot remain in suspension forever. Eventually, truth demands gravity. The turning point arrived with a territorial dispute in the South Atlantic, the Falkland Islands, or as Argentines know them, the Islas Malvinas. The decision to reclaim them in 1982 was meant to reignite national pride. Instead, the brief disastrous conflict exposed the fragility of the regime. When disillusioned soldiers returned, public confidence in the junta collapsed almost overnight. The era of silence was over. Across Argentina, people began to speak with a freedom they had forgotten. Newspapers tested the limits of censorship, and families shared their stories without whispering. The transition from silence to speech was not loud. It was steady, like a sunrise after a long night. In 1983, democracy returned. The new president, Raúl Alfonsín, promised truth through law, not vengeance. His first act was to create the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons. Their report, titled Nunca Más, Never Again, became a collective vow, a promise that Argentina would face its past and transform silence into education. It gave a name to the long, invisible chapter. Schools began to teach civic ethics again, asking the living questions. How is freedom preserved? What happens when fear becomes policy? The past was not a wound to be hidden, but a compass for the future. The mothers of Plaza de Mayo continued their walks, no longer defying silence but honoring persistence. The image that once frightened the powerful had become the moral symbol of modern Argentina. The same plazas that once echoed with caution now resounded with free conversation. Argentina's journey shows us a powerful truth. A society can be wounded by secrecy, but it can be healed by memory. The dictatorship tried to control the story, but in the end, the people reclaimed it. The absence of thousands became the moral presence of millions who vowed never again. The dawn of 1983 in Argentina didn't break with noise. It unfolded quietly, like light finding its way through shutters that had been closed for too long. After 7 years under the military junta, democracy had returned. The new president, Raúl Alfonsín, took office with a solemn promise that echoed through the hearts of millions. Justice through truth, not vengeance. He declared that Argentina would face its history directly, no longer as rumor but as record. One of Alfonsín's first acts was creating CONADEP, the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons. Its purpose was simple yet immense: to document what had truly happened. It had no authority to punish, only to reveal. But in a country where revelation itself had been forbidden, that was revolutionary. Families lined up outside their modest offices, carrying letters, photographs, or just a memory. Every testimony was recorded carefully, each detail treated as sacred evidence of existence. The state was finally listening, not to control, but to understand. As months passed, the work expanded. Investigators traveled across the country, collecting thousands of pages of testimonies. The nation itself had become a witness stand. When the final report was completed in 1984, its title carried a mournful and defiant message: Nunca más, never again. The report didn't point fingers, it held up a mirror. Its language was precise, its conclusion unmistakable. The systematic disappearance of thousands of citizens had occurred under state authority. Copies of Nunca Más sold out within hours. People read it in silence, on buses and in parks. For many, it was the first time they saw official acknowledgement of what they had long known in their hearts. Truth alone, however, was not enough. Justice had to follow. The government began the trial of the juntas, a legal proceeding unprecedented in Latin America. For the first time, former heads of a military dictatorship were brought before civilian judges. The courtroom was open, and every testimony was broadcast across the nation. The goal wasn't to humiliate, but to affirm the supremacy of law over power. The final verdicts symbolized not revenge, but renewal. Outside, in the Plaza de Mayo, the mothers who had marched for years under a silent sky now stood in open sunlight. Their white scarves no longer symbolized defiance. They symbolized triumph through truth. The mid-1980s in Argentina marked the rise of something deeper: a culture of remembrance. It began quietly, through art, literature, and collective expression. Where fear had once silenced voices, creativity now began to speak for those who could not. The streets of Buenos Aires became an open gallery. Walls once marked by slogans of control were now painted with murals of peace and memory. Phrases like "Nunca más" and "The truth shall set us free" were not acts of rebellion, but acts of reconstruction. The theater was among the first art forms to revive. Playwrights returned with works exploring the boundaries between truth and denial. Each performance became a ritual of healing. Music, too, carried the sound of renewal. Folk singers wrote ballads about courage, and the new generation of rock musicians sang of freedom, identity, and hope. Concerts turned into gatherings of collective catharsis, with audiences singing in unison. Not against someone, but for something. Unity and dignity. Cinema emerged as one of the most powerful mediums. In 1985, the film La Historia Oficial, The Official Story, captured international attention. It told the story of a mother who discovers her adopted daughter may have been born to one of the disappeared. The film won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, placing Argentina's struggle in the conscience of the world. Through films like this, Argentina taught the world that truth, when told with dignity, can educate more deeply than any political speech. Education became the foundation of the nation's moral rebuilding. Schools began to include the history of the 1970s in their curricula, not as accusation but as awareness. Teachers guided students to question how societies can drift from democracy into fear, and how they can return. Universities hosted conferences on memory and democracy, emphasizing that remembering isn't about living in the past, it's about preventing the past from repeating itself. Amid this cultural revival, the mothers of Plaza de Mayo remained the moral center. Artists painted their white scarves on buildings. Musicians dedicated songs to them. The image of these women, walking in circles, came to represent the endurance of human conscience. The Museum of Memory, built on the site of a former detention facility, opened its doors as a space of learning. It reminded everyone that memory is not a burden, but a bridge. The younger generation, born after the dictatorship, grew up surrounded by this culture. For them, democracy wasn't just a political system, it was a moral inheritance. By the end of the decade, Argentina had transformed from a nation of whispers into a nation of words. Economic struggles persisted, but challenges now unfolded in the open. The language of fear had been replaced by the language of reflection. The idea of nunca más, never again, was carved into the nation's moral fabric. But as the 1990s dawned, a new question loomed. Could Argentina preserve its moral clarity while facing the complex realities of power, politics, and change? The new millennium dawned quietly over Buenos Aires. The city's skyline shimmered in the early sunlight, but beneath its modern rhythm beat the echoes of an older struggle. A story Argentina was still writing, not just for itself, but for the world. By the early 2000s, this nation had transformed into a symbol of moral endurance. It had survived dictatorship, navigated a fragile democracy, and was reclaiming its soul through memory. But this story wouldn't stay confined to the banks of the River Plate. It was about to resonate far beyond. What was once called the Dirty War was now understood not just as a national tragedy, but as a pivotal chapter in global human rights history. The courage of the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the defiance of journalists and artists, the endurance of families searching for decades, these had become universal emblems of resistance against oppression everywhere. International organizations began studying Argentina's approach to transitional justice, inspired by how the country managed to balance remembrance with reconstruction. Then, in 2003, President Nestor Kirchner entered office, reigniting the nation's pursuit of historical accountability. Kirchner represented a generation that had lived through the fear of the 1970s and was now determined to rewrite the future with courage. He took bold steps, ordering portraits of dictatorship-era military leaders to be removed from army headquarters, reopening closed trials, and symbolically returning the ESMA, once a notorious detention center, and transforming it into a museum of memory. This transformation of a place once defined by silence into a monument of remembrance carried immense symbolic weight. It was as if Argentina had turned its pain into architecture. The reopening of trials in 2005 was a defining moment. After amnesty laws were repealed, the Supreme Court ruled them unconstitutional, declaring that crimes against humanity could never be forgiven by legal shortcuts. This decision reopened hundreds of cases that had been frozen for decades. For survivors and families, it was the restoration of faith. They could finally stand in courtrooms and speak without fear, facing not revenge, but truth. Argentina wasn't just recovering, it was rebuilding its moral infrastructure. As these trials unfolded, society learned once again how to listen. Television broadcasts covered testimonies. Newspapers printed the voices of those who had been silenced. The process was emotional, but it brought collective clarity. Argentina was redefining what justice meant, not as punishment alone, but as recognition, dignity, and education. The nation was becoming its own teacher. Beyond its borders, other countries took notice. Chile, South Africa, and post-conflict nations in Africa and Eastern Europe looked to Buenos Aires for inspiration. The idea that a nation could peacefully confront its dark history became a model for global democracy. Argentine forensic experts, born from the country's own tragedy, traveled the world, helping identify victims in mass graves from the Balkans to Africa. The science created from Argentina's pain had become a gift of truth to humanity. At home, a new generation of artists emerged. Filmmakers, writers, and musicians who transformed historical trauma into creative energy. Films like The Official Story explored memory not as history, but as identity. Public murals across Buenos Aires bore the faces of the disappeared alongside messages of hope. In classrooms, students studied the era not as distant history, but as a living lesson in civic ethics. The narrative was no longer confined to loss. It was evolving into resilience. Where fear had once silenced voices, an entire culture now spoke freely about the value of democracy and human rights. The phrase "nunca más," never again, had expanded from a legal declaration into the very core of Argentine identity. It was no longer just a phrase. It was a national promise. By the late 2000s, under both Nestor Kirchner and later Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, Argentina deepened its moral commitment. Government institutions supported truth commissions, memory museums, and educational initiatives. Each anniversary of the coup became not a day of mourning, but a day of collective awareness. People gathered at the Plaza de Mayo, not just in protest, but in celebration of resilience. Children carried banners that read, "Democracy Forever," proving that remembrance had become an inheritance. Of course, this new era wasn't without challenges. Economic crises and political polarization sometimes tested the nation's unity. Some argued that reopening old wounds would hinder progress, while others insisted that only by confronting the past could Argentina truly move forward. But the strength of Argentine civil society never wavered. The human rights organizations, now decades old, remained pillars of moral integrity, embracing digital platforms to connect with young people who understood that freedom isn't inherited, it's maintained. The ESMA Museum of Memory became a global symbol, showing how a nation can turn sites of darkness into spaces of learning. Guides often repeated a single phrase that echoed across generations. Here, silence was broken. As the first decade of the 21st century closed, Argentina stood not as a nation of victims, but as one of survivors and teachers. Its message was clear and unwavering. Memory is the foundation of freedom. The 2010s brought a new dimension to this journey, moving beyond monuments and courtrooms into the digital age. A new generation had arrived, young people who had grown up surrounded by the lessons of the dictatorship. For them, "Nunca más" wasn't a historical slogan. It was a living ethic, a compass guiding their sense of justice. Their battlefield was no longer just the streets. It was the internet, the classroom, and the collective memory of a nation determined never to forget. By now, the Argentine model of transitional justice was being studied worldwide. But inside the country, the story was still evolving. Technology changed how history was preserved. The voices that once echoed through the Plaza de Mayo now spread through hashtags and online archives. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the disappeared became digital storytellers. Projects like Memoria Abierta, Open Memory, collected photos, testimonies, and documents, making them accessible to anyone, anywhere. Remembrance became a global act. In classrooms, history became interactive. Students explored timelines, listened to survivor interviews, and connected past injustices to modern issues like discrimination and misinformation. Argentina had achieved something remarkable. It had transformed remembrance into a democratic ritual. On every anniversary of the 1976 coup, millions of Argentines posted messages with hashtags like Nunca Más. These simple digital acts were a powerful reminder that remembrance was not fading. It was evolving. During this decade, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo continued their mission with incredible resolve. Now in their 80s and 90s, their voices were as strong as ever. Thanks to advancements in DNA testing, more grandchildren were being identified. Each reunion was a national event, a testament to persistence and love. In 2014, the organization's leader, Estela de Carlotto, found her own grandson after a 36-year search. The nation celebrated with her, reminded that time cannot silence truth. Meanwhile, the judiciary continued its work. New trials were held with the calm authority of law, proving that justice delayed did not have to mean justice denied. The ESMA memory site also evolved, adding new exhibits and workshops that empowered young people to become guardians of this history. Art remained a vital form of remembrance, with street murals and music festivals turning grief into creative expression and a bridge between generations. Even as political leadership changed, the culture of remembrance had transcended ideology. It no longer belonged to one party or one movement. It belonged to everyone. The moral lessons of the Dirty War were woven into the very fabric of national identity. To forget was to fail not only history, but the future itself. In this era, Argentina's story continued to inspire others. Countries like Colombia and Tunisia sought Argentine expertise in building their own truth commissions. The nation that had once whispered in fear now spoke with clarity. It had learned that democracy is not a destination, but a journey. A continuous act of remembering, questioning, and evolving. In the early 2020s, a new chapter began for Argentina. It was no longer just a nation that had survived a dark past, but one that had transformed its pain into profound wisdom. Decades after the Dirty War, the once whispered stories of fear had become a national vocabulary of awareness. Argentina didn't carry its past as a burden, but as a banner, a powerful reminder of the price of freedom. For the new generation, born into a democratic digital world, the struggle wasn't against tanks or secret decrees. It was against something far more subtle: forgetfulness. As the living witnesses to the dictatorship grew older, their voices softer, a crucial question emerged. Not just what happened, but how do we keep remembering? The answer came in forms both innovative and deeply human. Interactive museums began using virtual reality to let visitors walk through historical sites, creating a visceral connection to the past. The ESMA Memory Museum, once a notorious detention center, expanded its reach globally, collaborating with universities abroad. Argentina's model for restoring democracy was no longer just its own story. It became a cornerstone of global civic education. Every year on March 24th, the Day of Remembrance for Truth and Justice, millions fill the streets. These marches are no longer just protests. They are pilgrimages. Grandparents who once marched in fearful silence now walk hand in hand with grandchildren, streaming the event live to the world. Children carry signs reading, "They tried to erase them. We remember them." In a poetic twist of fate, the technology of today amplifies the voices that were once silenced. Meanwhile, the pursuit of justice continued, methodical and unwavering. Even decades later, new evidence surfaced from digital archives and forensic research. In 2021, Argentina reached a quiet but profound milestone: its 1,000th conviction for crimes committed during the dictatorship. Each case reaffirmed a core belief: time cannot dissolve justice. This tireless work was pioneered by the Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team, or EIAF. Once a small group of passionate scientists, they grew into a world-renowned institution. They continued to identify remains from unmarked graves, bringing closure to countless families. But their mission didn't stop at their borders. From Mexico to Ethiopia, from the Balkans to Asia, Argentina's scientists trained others to find truth buried beneath the soil of silence, extending the nation's moral legacy across the globe. This era also sparked a cultural awakening. Filmmakers produced powerful documentaries exploring how memory shapes identity. Artists blended history with modern social issues, linking the fight for truth to themes like environmental justice and gender equality. The message was clear. Human rights are not confined to one era. They are the ongoing measure of a society's conscience. And a new generation of guardians emerged. Armed with smartphones and social media, young activists became digital defenders of history. They shared stories, organized virtual memorials, and challenged the misinformation that spread so quickly online. They understood that their vigilance was the strongest barrier against the distortion of truth. In schools, memory and democracy modules became part of the curriculum, teaching students not only what happened, but why it must never happen again. Argentina wasn't just teaching its past, it was cultivating a generation equipped to safeguard its future. This commitment resonated on the world stage. Argentina's model of truth and reconciliation inspired reforms in international law. The concept of enforced disappearance became recognized as a global crime against humanity, thanks in large part to Argentina's tireless advocacy. The phrase nunca más, never again, entered the global vocabulary, a shared moral promise spoken in countless languages. At home, memory became woven into the fabric of everyday life. Streets were renamed after victims. TV dramas and podcasts brought historical memory into popular culture, making the past emotionally present and impossible to ignore. The country had learned that political disagreement wasn't a weakness, but the very heartbeat of a healthy democracy. Perhaps the most moving development was how remembrance became a collective identity. When students were asked what nunca más meant to them, their answers had evolved. They said, "It means respecting everyone. It means listening before judging. It means speaking up when others cannot." These weren't reflections of trauma, but of transformation. The nation had turned memory into a form of hope. The descendants of the disappeared now speak at international conferences, not to dwell on the past, but to ensure its darkest hours never return. Their words carry weight, not just for Argentina, but for any nation wrestling with its conscience. As Argentina faces the challenges of today, economic transitions, technological change, and social reforms, it carries an invisible strength, built over half a century of reflection. The dirty war no longer defines Argentina by what was lost, but by what was learned. From the cobbled streets of San Telmo to the modern towers of Puerto Madero, murals tell the story. The faces of the disappeared are painted beside three powerful words: verdad, memoria, justicia, truth, memory, justice. These paintings aren't just symbols of sorrow. They are symbols of vigilance, whispering to every passerby. Freedom lives through remembrance. Argentina's journey has become a global template for societies struggling with their own difficult pasts. The mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, though older now, became global ambassadors of conscience, reminding the world that peace is born not from silence, but from remembrance. The once shadowed nation had become a classroom for humanity, teaching that confronting the past is not an act of division, but an act of healing. In 2025, Argentina marked nearly half a century since the beginning of that dark period. It was not a day of mourning, but a celebration of endurance. In the Plaza de Mayo, thousands gathered, a living testament to the nation's resilience. At the center of the plaza, a new plaque was unveiled, engraved with the words that define Argentina's journey. To remember is to live again with dignity. To forget is to surrender the soul of a nation. The ghosts of fear have been replaced by voices of unity. The nation that once whispered now speaks freely, reminding the world that justice, though patient, is inevitable. Today, as night falls over Buenos Aires, the city hums with the energy of life. The plazas that once trembled with fear now echo with music, laughter, and conversation. Argentina's story now belongs to the world, a testament that healing is possible, that justice can triumph, and that memory is the bridge between pain and peace. The story of Argentina's dirty war didn't end when the last trial concluded or when the final report was signed. It continued, transforming into something far greater, a living, breathing message that resonated across continents. The darkness that once shrouded Argentina was turned into a beacon of light for the entire world. After democracy returned in 1983, Argentina began its slow rise from the shadows. But what makes its story so unique is that it didn't just stop at national healing. It became a lesson shared with everyone. The Nunca Más report, the foundation of Argentina's truth movement, spread far beyond its borders, becoming a blueprint for justice and remembrance. Its simple yet powerful message, "Never again," transcended language and culture. Governments, scholars, and activists across the globe studied Argentina's approach, learning how memory could be turned into a force for renewal, not revenge. In South Africa, as Nelson Mandela's nation prepared for its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Argentine experts were quietly consulted. The architects of South Africa's truth process admired Argentina's courage to face its past directly, to listen to testimonies without censorship, and to document every act of injustice with empathy rather than hatred. Across the ocean, two nations, each scarred in their own way, found a connection in their shared belief that forgiveness can only begin where truth is honored. By the early 2000s, Argentina had become one of the most respected voices in international human rights. Its diplomats spoke at the United Nations, advocating for a new global understanding of justice, one not rooted in punishment alone, but in restoration and remembrance. The country played a crucial role in creating the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, a landmark treaty that recognized the inherent right of all human beings to never vanish without accountability. This treaty was, in many ways, Argentina's promise to the world that its own tragedy would serve a higher purpose. While political reforms shaped the country's policies, the true strength of Argentina's rebirth came from its people. Artists, poets, and filmmakers became the new storytellers of conscience. Through cinema and literature, they captured the nation's emotional rebirth. Films like The Official Story carried Argentina's truth to global audiences, winning awards and opening the world's eyes to what had once been hidden. Each film, each piece of art, became a bridge connecting the past with the present, reminding viewers that silence is the true enemy of justice. Meanwhile, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo continued their quiet revolution. They traveled from city to city, university to university, telling their stories not with bitterness, but with unwavering faith. They spoke of the missing children, some of whom had grown up unaware of their true origins, and of the importance of identity as a sacred human right. Over time, more than 130 of these children were identified, thanks to the tireless work of scientists and activists who used forensic technology developed in Argentina itself. What had begun as a local search for truth became one of the greatest humanitarian missions of the modern age. The Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team, founded in 1984, became world-renowned for its precision and compassion. Its members, many of them young scientists driven by moral conviction, traveled to countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Bosnia to help locate and identify victims of political violence. The team embodied Argentina's evolution from victim to guide, from a country that had once been silenced to one that now helped others speak. The tools of science, fused with empathy, became Argentina's great contribution to global justice. In Buenos Aires, the transformation of the Izme Naval School, once a symbol of absolute fear, into a memory museum, marked one of the most profound acts of healing in modern history. The same walls that had once held despair now held the truth. Exhibits detailed not just the pain, but the incredible resilience of those who resisted. Visitors from around the world now come to walk its halls, often leaving in silence, carrying with them a piece of Argentina's lesson, that light can be born even in the darkest of places if one only dares to remember. Schools across Argentina began teaching the history of the Dirty War not as a distant event, but as a moral compass for future generations. Teachers encouraged open discussions about democracy, justice, and ethics. Students studied real testimonies, wrote essays about human dignity, and created art inspired by Nunca Más. For these young Argentines, many born long after the dictatorship, memory became more than just history, it became their identity. By the 2010s, Argentina's moral influence had expanded far beyond Latin America. In Asia, Africa, and Europe, governments and NGOs invited Argentine scholars to share how their country built a sustainable culture of truth. They learned that Argentina's greatest secret wasn't in its laws or institutions, it was in its humanity. The nation had discovered that memory is not simply about recording the past, it's about transforming it into wisdom. Global movements for justice and democracy began referencing Argentina's example. When people protested against oppression in other countries, They often carried banners that read, Nunca más. The phrase had evolved from a national motto into a global declaration of conscience. It was painted on murals, printed on T-shirts, and engraved in monuments on distant shores. Argentina's past had become a universal language of remembrance. Inside Argentina, remembrance continues to live in everyday life. Every March 24th, the National Day of Memory for Truth and Justice, millions gather peacefully in streets and plazas to honor those who disappeared. There are no shouts of anger, only the rhythmic beating of drums, songs of solidarity, and candles lighting the night sky. Parents bring their children to teach them the importance of never forgetting. The plazas glow not with sorrow, but with strength, a symbol of unity that transcends generations. In that spirit, Buenos Aires became a capital of moral reflection. International scholars, artists, and diplomats came not to mourn, but to learn. They saw how a country once divided by silence had built bridges of empathy through truth. Argentina's transformation showed that justice, when pursued with heart and patience, could restore faith not only in government, but in humanity itself. The echoes of Argentina's past now live in a future it helped shape. The country's courage inspired others to break their silence, to look inward, and to confront uncomfortable truths with dignity. From Rwanda to Cambodia, from the Balkans to the Middle East, people invoked Argentina's name not as a victim, as cry, but as a survivor, as anthem. And yet, despite all the recognition, Argentina has remained humble. Its people understand that remembrance is not an achievement. It is a responsibility. Every generation must guard it, nurture it, and pass it on. Because if memory fades, history can repeat itself. As the sun sets over Buenos Aires, the city hums with life. The air is filled with laughter, music, and stories. Proof that a nation once silenced has found its voice again. The grandmothers who once marched alone are now accompanied by their children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. They walk not in mourning, but in triumph. For in the rhythm of their footsteps lies the heartbeat of a nation reborn. Argentina's story, rooted in suffering but blossoming into strength, has become one of humanity's most powerful lessons. It reminds the world that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has the power to rise. And when it does, it not only restores justice, it restores faith in the human spirit itself. Thank you so much for watching.
The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at Join Criminology and step deeper into the dark with us.